In today's video, we're diving into the world of calisthenics and its impact on MMA training. We'll explore a few major pros and some notable cons of training bodyweight exercises for fighting. I think the best place to start is with the most obvious benefit, and that is upper body muscular development. For the upper body, calisthenics checks a few of the most important boxes for hypertrophy. One of those boxes is training close to failure, as this is pretty well established in the literature to drive hypertrophic gains. Folks who do calisthenic movements often perform repetitions at least close to or maybe even to failure in movements like the pull-ups or muscle-ups, dips, front levers, back levers, planches, which would in turn develop muscles like the lats, triceps, pecs, and forearm flexors. Now, the second box that it checks for hypertrophic gains in some movements is emphasizing the deep stretch. When you're doing full range of motion pull-ups from a dead hang, the lats are in a really stretched position. Similarly, if you're learning how to develop your straddle planche, for example, so your forearms and your finger flexors are going to be put on a massive stretch, since they're contracting at a maximal length to stabilize the movement. Not to mention the bicep, pec, and shoulder development on these guys, which, similar to gymnasts, likely come from long duration holds performed at increased muscle lengths, specifically with movements like the back lever on the bars of the rings. Another aspect of calisthenic movement or bodyweight training that I would consider a pro is kinesthetic awareness or trunk control. Now, this is especially true whenever you're getting to more of the advanced movements like planks and levers, and especially some of these crazy pull-ups these guys start to do. What I'm not saying is that the trunk is getting as strong as it could doing these movements. While you may get stronger in the trunk, your trunk may not get as strong as if you did some of the other heavier lifts. I talked about this in a previous video, where I went over how a lot of the higher muscle activity in the trunk muscles comes from larger multi-joint compound movements. The other aspect of this is the fact that your ability to recognize where your body is in space could be helpful for athletic development. I'm definitely not saying this type of training is going to make you better at fighting. Sparring is going to make you better at fighting. But compared to somebody who didn't have any previous athletic experience, it's likely that you would understand how your body moves a little bit better. So it's very likely to help you understand your awareness of your center of mass and may help you get a bit stronger in your trunk muscles, although for some muscle groups, maybe not as strong as heavy lifting. The third and final pro that I'll touch on is upper body joint resilience and mobility. There are a lot of movements in calisthenics that require an immense amount of shoulder, elbow, and wrist mobility. The most obvious is the amount of shoulder mobility that's required to do a very simple movement like the pull-up. Then you move on to more advanced movements like the skin the cat, and the requisite amount of mobility and strength to stabilize the joint during that movement is much higher. Another movement is the planche. Look at the amount of wrist extension required to maintain that forward trunk translation. I mean, good luck trying to wrist lock that guy. This is also under the assumption that you gradually progress these movements and that you allow for adequate recovery. Otherwise, your risk for injury and setbacks start to increase. Before we move on to the cons, let's take a look at an example of a calisthenics movement and point out all the good stuff. All right, so this view is a view of the back lever. This is a movement that's pretty advanced, but I just want to show you why these guys are so developed in the upper body. We're going to look at three main muscles. We're going to look at the anterior delt, we're going to look at the pec, and we're also going to look at the bicep. And we're going to show why these guys usually have some pretty well-developed shoulders, chest, and arms. So in this back lever, we have to think about what the anterior delt does. The primary movement of the anterior delt is to raise the arm forward or flex the arm. It also assists, as we've seen in some other videos, with horizontal adduction. But right here, this is mainly taking advantage of the primary movement. So this is in shoulder extension, but this is an isometric flexion contraction. It is flexing the shoulder to keep himself there in a lengthened position, which we know now is one of the boxes that would benefit you to check for if you're looking for hypertrophic gains. The next, we're going to look at the pec. So we know that the pec does horizontal adduction at the glenohumeral joint, but it also flexes the shoulder as well. It also internally rotates the shoulder. So here we've got an externally rotated shoulder, right? So if you were to take your arm, put them straight out in front of you, palms down, and then externally rotate them till they were palms up, and then bring it all the way back. So you're already putting the pec on a stretch by doing internal rotate or external rotation, and then by extending the shoulder again. But keep in mind that same thing, the pec is trying to internally rotate and flex the shoulder against the weight of his body. So again, a very lengthened position for the pec. And then possibly the most lengthened and the most advantaged muscle is the bicep. So the bicep does three things. It's two muscles, but we'll use it as one for this explanation here. So the bicep does three movements. It flexes the shoulder. It helps the anterior delt and the clavicular fibers of the pec do that. It also flexes at the elbow, the humeral ulnar joint, but it also supinates at the proximal radial ulnar joint. The only way, so let's start at the top. So since it helps flex the shoulder, we already know that the shoulder is an extension. Since it helps flex the elbow, we already know that the elbow is an extension. The only thing that could be better, his hand is pronated, right? His forearm is pronated. So if his hands were palm facing up, that would put just a little bit more stretch on the bicep. Whoops. So this is why a lot of those calisthenics guys and a lot of those gymnasts have just a ton of upper body muscular development. And so this is just a really slow movement. This is how the back lever is performed on the rings. Yeah, so really good stuff from a hypertrophic standpoint. All right, now let's get to the cons. Again, we'll start with the most glaringly obvious, and that is the lack of lower body development in calisthenics. I mean, there's a reason why these guys wear longer shorts and the camera never pans over their legs. In all seriousness though, most calisthenic athletes are perpetual leg day skippers, apart from maybe some lunges or bodyweight squats. And since throwing kicks and taking leg kicks are a huge part of fighting, most folks that only train calisthenics would benefit from incorporating good old-fashioned weighted back squats, lunges, RDLs, etc. to develop lower body muscle mass and thicker connective tissue, especially if their goal is to train more specifically for MMA. Even though they're very often dismounting a bar or jumping up to grab the bar, the rings, this isn't nearly enough to elicit any serious muscle growth or connective tissue adaptations that would almost certainly benefit you when you're fighting. Now, the second con also has to do with the lower body, but this time we're talking about power. Sometimes the calisthenics guys will do some free running or parkour, which does involve some explosive jumping and landing. These types of movements won't even come close to the amount of hip drive that you can get from something like a clean or the rotational power you can train with a full effort ball throw. Explosive movements like these help build power, which are often essential in movements like bridging out from bottom mount, for example, or throwing a leg kick. So most of the cons, and hopefully you guys expected this, come from the lack of training the lower body. Again, calisthenics has some characteristics that can certainly be beneficial if you want to shift your focus to MMA. However, if you only train calisthenics, you could almost certainly be preparing yourself better for fighting by incorporating some lower body hypertrophy and power movements into your training. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.